Hello, you're with Seraphim, and today I'm sharing a new original story about quiet strength, hidden truth, and the moment everything changes. The city councilwoman stood at the podium in City Hall, cameras flashing, microphones tilted toward her mouth like hungry birds, and she said 5 words that made every shop owner on the corner of 137th and Lenox Avenue feel the floor drop out from under their feet. "I know what you hid." She paused, let the silence chew on the room. Then she said, "And so did he. The man you called crazy. The man you spat on. The man who stood on that corner for 11 years in the rain and the snow and the heat, watching your doors, counting your faces, writing down your license plates in a notebook you never once thought to look at." But that moment, that satisfying, bone-deep, earth-shaking moment, did not come from nowhere. It started 15 years earlier, on a winter night so cold it could crack teeth, with a girl who had no shoes and a man who had nothing but a coat and a prayer. Ezekiel Morrow was not the kind of man people noticed. He was the kind of man people stepped around, the way you step around a puddle or a crack in the sidewalk. He stood on the southeast corner of 137th Street and Lenox Avenue every single day, rain or shine, summer or winter, from 6 in the morning until 9 at night. He wore the same brown coat, patched at the elbows with duct tape. He wore the same knit cap pulled low over his graying temples. He carried a Bible in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other, and he spoke. He spoke to anyone who passed. He spoke to no one. He spoke to the sky and the traffic and the pigeons and the fire hydrant. His voice was not loud, but it carried. It had a strange quality to it, like a bell struck underwater. You felt it more than you heard it. He quoted scripture sometimes. Other times he simply said things like, "Be careful today," or "Watch your children," or "The Lord sees what happens behind closed doors." People thought he was crazy. People said he was crazy. People wanted him gone. Mrs. Delphine Okafor, who owned the hair braiding salon 2 doors down from the corner, had called the police on Ezekiel 43 times in 6 years. She kept count. She wrote the dates in the margin of her appointment book with a red pen, the way a hunter marks kills on a rifle stock. "That man is driving away my customers," she told Officer Reyes every time. "He stinks, he mumbles, he scares the children." Officer Reyes would come, talk to Ezekiel, and leave. There was nothing to charge him with. He was not aggressive. He was not drunk. He was not blocking the sidewalk. He was just there. Gerald Fontaine, who ran the check-cashing place on the other side of the street, was less polite about it. Gerald was a big man, wide across the shoulders, with a gold chain thick as a dog leash and a voice that sounded like gravel being poured into a tin bucket. He did not call the police. He handled things himself. Once, in August, when the temperature hit 102 degrees, Gerald walked across the street with a bucket of dirty mop water and poured it over Ezekiel's head. The water was gray and smelled like pine sol and old pennies. Ezekiel did not move. He did not flinch. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his coat and kept speaking. "You see that?" Gerald said to the cluster of men standing outside the barber shop next door. He pointed at Ezekiel with a thick finger. Man didn't even react. "That's how you know he's gone. Lights on, nobody home." The men laughed. Some of them clapped Gerald on the back. A woman pushing a stroller shook her head and hurried past. Nobody said a word in Ezekiel's defense. Nobody ever did. That was the unspoken rule of 137th and Lenox. The preacher was a fixture, like a broken streetlight. You complained about it, you worked around it, but you never fixed it, and you certainly never asked it how it felt. But Ezekiel heard everything. He saw everything. His eyes, behind those heavy lids and that faraway expression, were sharp as surgical steel. He noticed things that other people missed because other people were not looking. He noticed the van that pulled up behind Gerald's check-cashing place every Tuesday and Thursday night at exactly 11:15. He noticed that the van had no license plate, just a piece of cardboard taped over the spot where the plate should be. He noticed the girls. They came out of the van in groups of 3 or 4, young, thin, quiet in a way that was not shyness, but fear. They never looked up. Their eyes stayed fixed on the ground, on their feet, on the hand of whatever man guided them from the van to the back door of the building. Ezekiel watched. He counted. He wrote things down in a small notebook he kept inside the lining of his coat, pressed against his chest where no one would think to look. He had been watching for 6 years. He had been counting for 6 years. He had filled 9 notebooks. The notebooks contained dates, times, physical descriptions, partial license plate numbers he caught on the rare occasions the cardboard slipped, the makes and models of cars that visited the back entrance, the names he overheard when the men spoke carelessly on the sidewalk, thinking no one was listening. Because who listens to a crazy man? Who worries about the ears of a man who talks to pigeons? That was the genius of it. That was why Ezekiel stood on that corner. Not because God told him to preach, because God told him to watch. And watch he did, with the patience of stone, with the discipline of a soldier, and with a fury buried so deep inside his chest that it never once showed on his face. He had tried the normal way first. Years ago, before the corner, before the coat, before the Bible and the thermos and the daily performance of harmless madness, Ezekiel Morrow had been a different man. He had been a social worker in the Bronx, assigned to Child Protective Services. He wore pressed shirts and carried a briefcase and drove a Honda Civic with a cracked windshield. He investigated cases of abuse and neglect. He filed reports, he followed procedures, and he watched, over and over, as the system failed. Children returned to dangerous homes, cases closed for lack of evidence, judges who did not want to hear it, supervisors who did not want to see it. The case that broke him was a girl named Aaliyah Simmons, 14 years old, placed with a foster family that was supposed to be safe. Ezekiel had checked the home himself. Clean kitchen, fresh sheets, a backyard with a swing set. The foster father, a man named Dale Hutchins, shook Ezekiel's hand with a firm grip and a warm smile and said, "We just want to give these kids a chance." 6 months later, Aaliyah Simmons was found dead in a motel room off the Grand Concourse. She had been trafficked. Dale Hutchins had sold her to a network that operated out of 3 businesses in Upper Manhattan. One of those businesses was a check-cashing place on 137th Street. Ezekiel filed every report. He went to the police. He went to the district attorney's office. He went to the newspapers. Nobody acted. The evidence was circumstantial, they said. The connections were too thin, they said. Dale Hutchins had a clean record and a lawyer who played golf with a judge. The case went nowhere. Aaliyah Simmons became a statistic. Her name appeared in a database, then disappeared from the world. But she did not disappear from Ezekiel's mind. She lived there, behind his eyes, in a room he could not close the door to. And so he quit his job, sold his car, gave up his apartment, and went to stand on a corner. His plan was not complicated. It was simply long. He would watch. He would gather what the system called insufficient evidence until the pile was so high it could not be ignored. He would become invisible by becoming visible. A crazy man, a street preacher, a piece of the scenery. And he would wait. He had no timeline. He had no deadline. He had Aaliyah Simmons's face in his memory, and that was enough fuel to burn for a lifetime. So he stood there, through the rain that soaked his coat to the bone, through the August heat that made the sidewalk shimmer, through the snowstorms that turned 137th Street into a white canyon of silence. He stood there and he watched. The neighbors on the block knew nothing about any of this. To them, Ezekiel was simply a nuisance with a Bible. Mrs. Okafor braided hair and talked about him in Igbo to her niece Chinyere, who worked the register. Onye Ara, she called him, crazy person. She was a proud woman, Mrs. Okafor. She had come to this country 22 years ago with $400 and a suitcase full of determination. She had built her salon from nothing. She worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Her hands were rough from years of pulling thread through synthetic hair, and her back ached constantly, but her salon was hers. She had earned every inch of it. She did not like anything that threatened her business, and Ezekiel, with his mumbling and his stained coat and his wild eyes, was a threat. Customers hesitated at the door. New clients sometimes turned around. A woman from the Upper East Side who had come for box braids once said to Mrs. Okafor, "Is it safe here? That man outside." Mrs. Okafor had smiled her brightest smile and said, "Oh, he's harmless. Just ignore him." But inside, she was burning. She went home that night and told her husband Franklin that she wanted the preacher gone. Franklin, a quiet man who drove a bus for the MTA, just nodded and said, "Maybe leave the man alone, Delphine. He's not hurting anyone." "He's hurting my business," she hissed. Franklin went back to watching the news. He had learned, after 19 years of marriage, that when Delphine Okafor set her mind on something, she would not stop until she got it or exhausted everyone around her. Usually, both. But Franklin had a soft spot for Ezekiel. Once, during a rainstorm, Franklin had seen the preacher give his coat to a homeless woman who was shivering in the doorway of the laundromat. Ezekiel had stood in the rain in his shirt sleeves for 3 hours after that, water streaming down his face, still speaking, still watching. Franklin had thought, "That's not a crazy man. That's a man who cares about something we can't see." But Franklin kept this thought to himself. In the ecosystem of 137th and Lenox, keeping thoughts to yourself was a survival skill. You did not get involved. You did not ask questions about what happened behind Gerald Fontaine's check-cashing place after dark. You did not wonder about the van with no plates. You did not mention the girls. If you saw something, you adjusted your eyes. If you heard something, you turned up the television. That was the deal. That was how the block worked. And everyone, from Mrs. Okafor to the barber to the bodega owner to the woman who sold tamales from a cart on the corner, everyone kept the deal. Everyone except Ezekiel. The winter of that year came early and came mean. By November, the temperature had already dropped into the 20s, and the wind off the Harlem River cut through clothing like it was made of paper. Ezekiel stood on his corner. He had added a second coat, this one a threadbare army surplus jacket he had found in a donation bin behind the Salvation Army on 125th Street. It smelled like mothballs and diesel fuel, but it kept the wind out, mostly. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, a bright yellow scarf that his sister Margaret had knitted for him 3 Christmases ago, before she stopped speaking to him because she was convinced he had lost his mind. The scarf was the only color on him. Everything else was brown and gray and faded, like a photograph left in the sun. But the yellow scarf caught people's eyes. It was the one thing about Ezekiel that people remembered when they described him. The preacher with the yellow scarf. It became his signature, though he never intended it to be. He wore it because it was warm, and because Margaret had made it, and because even a man who has given up most of the comforts of life needs one small thing to hold on to. On the night of December 14th, the temperature dropped to 11 degrees. The streets emptied early. Mrs. Okafor closed her salon at 7 instead of 9 because her last 3 appointments had canceled. Gerald Fontaine pulled down the metal gate over his storefront at 8, which was unusual. He normally stayed open until 10. The bodega owner locked up at 8:30. By 9 o'clock, the block was a ghost town. The streetlights cast orange circles on the frozen sidewalk. A stray cat darted into an alley and disappeared. The only sound was the wind, howling through the gaps between buildings like a lost animal. Ezekiel was still there. He had moved from his usual spot to the small alcove between the salon and the dry cleaners, where the buildings created a shallow pocket of shelter from the wind. He sat on a milk crate, his 2 coats pulled tight, his yellow scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face so that only his eyes showed. His thermos was empty. His coffee had been gone since 4 o'clock. He blew on his hands. His fingers were stiff. The cold had gotten into his knees, and he knew from experience that tomorrow he would walk like an old man, shuffling and wincing, for at least the first hour. He was about to leave. For the first time in months, he was about to break his routine and go to the shelter on 135th Street early, before they locked the doors at 10. The cold was simply too much. Even a man on a mission had limits, and tonight Ezekiel had found his. He put his hands on his knees, braced himself, and started to stand. And that was when he heard it. A sound so small it was almost nothing. A whimper. Not a cat. Not the wind. A human sound, thin and high and desperate, coming from the direction of the alley that ran behind Gerald Fontaine's building. Ezekiel froze. He tilted his head, the way a dog does when it hears something just beyond the range of understanding. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, from the mouth of the alley, a figure appeared. Small, moving fast but not running, stumbling, lurching, one hand pressed against the brick wall for balance. Ezekiel squinted. The streetlight was 20 feet away, and its glow barely reached the alley entrance. But he could make out enough. A girl, young, thin, no coat, no shoes. Her feet were bare on the frozen sidewalk, and even from this distance, Ezekiel could see that her arms were wrapped around herself so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold her own body together. She came out of the alley and stopped. Her head swiveled left, then right. The quick panic scan of an animal that knows it is being hunted. She was breathing hard. Clouds of white vapor poured from her mouth in rapid, shallow bursts. She wore a thin dress, a summer dress, Ezekiel noted with a jolt of horror, that ended above her knees. Her legs were bare. In 11-degree weather, on a night when the wind chill was in the negatives. This girl had minutes, maybe, before the cold shut her body down. Ezekiel did not hesitate. He did not think about safety or procedure or protocol. He had spent too many years doing that. He stood up from his milk crate, and the movement startled her. She whipped around to face him, and he saw her eyes for the first time. Wide, dark, wet with tears that the cold was freezing on her cheeks. She was maybe 15, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because fear has a way of stripping the age from a face, making everyone look ancient and newborn at the same time. "Easy," Ezekiel said. His voice was calm, low, steady. The voice he had used years ago when he sat across the table from frightened children in CPS offices. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Ezekiel. I'm the man who stands on this corner. You've probably seen me before. I'm not going to touch you. I'm just going to take off my coat, and I'm going to set it on the ground between us, and you can pick it up if you want it, okay?" The girl did not speak. She stared at him. Her body was shaking, not trembling, shaking, the kind of violent full-body shudder that means the muscles are starting to seize. Ezekiel slowly unzipped his outer coat, the army surplus jacket, and bent down and placed it on the sidewalk, then stepped back 3 paces. He held his hands where she could see them, empty, open, harmless. The girl looked at the coat. She looked at Ezekiel. She looked at the alley behind her. Then she lunged forward, grabbed the coat, and wrapped it around herself so fast it was like watching someone put out a fire on their own body. "My name is Ezekiel," he said again. "What's yours?" She shook her head. Not a refusal, more like she had forgotten, or like the answer was too heavy to lift right now. "That's all right," Ezekiel said gently. "You don't have to tell me anything. Are you hurt?" She nodded, a single small nod. "Can you walk?" Another nod, smaller this time, uncertain. "Okay, I know a place. It's warm, it's safe. There are women there, only women, and they will help you. It's about 12 blocks from here. Can you make it 12 blocks?" She looked at him for a long time. 10 seconds, 20. In those 20 seconds, the wind screamed down Lenox Avenue, and Ezekiel felt the cold bite through his remaining coat all the way to his ribs. He did not move. He waited. "Yes," the girl whispered. It was the first word she had spoken. Her voice was so raw it sounded like tearing cloth. "Yes, I can walk." Ezekiel nodded. "Then let's go," he said. "I'll walk ahead of you. You stay behind me, whatever distance feels safe. If you want to stop, say stop. If you want to run, run. I won't chase you. I won't even turn around. I'll just keep walking until we get there." He turned and started walking north on Lenox. After a moment, he heard her footsteps behind him. Light, uneven, the sound of bare feet slapping frozen concrete. The sound cut into him like a blade. He unwound his yellow scarf from his neck and, without turning around, held it out behind him. "For your feet," he said. "Wrap it around them. It's not much, but it's something." He felt a gentle tug as she took the scarf. He kept walking. The 12 blocks to the safe house on 149th Street took almost an hour. The girl could not move fast. Twice she stopped and leaned against a building, gasping, and Ezekiel stopped too, standing 10 feet ahead of her, facing forward, giving her the dignity of not being watched in her weakness. Once, she stumbled and fell to one knee, and he heard a sound come out of her that was not a cry but something worse, a silence, a held breath, the sound of someone who has learned that crying brings punishment. When they reached the brownstone on 149th Street, Ezekiel walked up the steps and pressed the buzzer 3 times, paused, then pressed it twice more. A code. The door opened, and a woman appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a no-nonsense expression that softened immediately when she saw the girl behind Ezekiel. "Lord have mercy," the woman said quietly. "Come in, baby. Come inside right now." The girl looked at Ezekiel. For the first time, something other than fear appeared in her eyes. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of one human being seeing another and knowing, in the marrow of their bones, that this person is safe. "Thank you," she whispered. Ezekiel nodded. "Go on inside," he said. "Mrs. Calloway is going to take care of you. You're going to be all right." The girl went inside. The door closed. Ezekiel stood on the steps for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then he turned and walked back south on Lenox Avenue, 12 blocks. Back to his corner. He sat down on his milk crate, coatless in 11-degree weather, pulled his remaining thin jacket around his chest, and began to write in his notebook. Date, time, description of the girl, the direction she had come from, the alley behind Gerald Fontaine's building. He wrote until his fingers were too numb to hold the pen. Then he put the notebook back inside his jacket, against his chest, and he waited for morning. He did not get the scarf back. He did not ask for it back. He never saw that yellow scarf again. But he would hear about it, years later, in a way he never expected. The girl's name was Naomi Price. She was 15 years old. She was from Greensboro, North Carolina, and she had been missing for 7 months. Her mother, Denise Price, had filed a report with the Greensboro Police Department on May 19th, the day after Naomi did not come home from school. Denise worked 2 jobs, daytime as a receptionist at a dental office, evenings as a cashier at a gas station. And by the time she realized Naomi was not at her friend Keisha's house like she said she would be, it was almost midnight. The police took the report. They searched for 2 weeks, then they stopped. Naomi had been recruited by a man she met on Instagram. He called himself Jalen. He was 26 years old, though he told her he was 19. His profile picture showed a handsome face, a clean car, designer clothes. He told Naomi she was beautiful. He told Naomi she was special. He told Naomi he could take her places, show her things, give her the life she deserved. He sent her gifts, a phone, a pair of sneakers, a necklace with a tiny gold heart. Each gift was a link in a chain she could not see. By the time she got into his car outside the Walmart on Westgate City Boulevard, the chain was already around her throat. He drove her to New York. The drive took 9 hours. He bought her McDonald's and let her choose the music. He was charming. He was patient. He was building a prison with smiles and compliments. And Naomi did not understand what was happening until they arrived at an apartment in the Bronx where 3 other girls were already waiting. Girls who did not smile. Girls who did not speak. Girls whose eyes were flat and empty, like windows in an abandoned house. That was when Naomi understood. That was when the door closed, not just on the apartment, but on her childhood. For 7 months, she was moved between locations: the apartment in the Bronx, a house in Newark, a room above a restaurant in Yonkers, and 3 times a week for the last 2 months, the building behind Gerald Fontaine's check-cashing place on 137th Street. She was brought in through the alley, taken through the back door, held in a room with no windows and a mattress on the floor and a lock on the outside. She was given food once a day. She was given a dress and told to keep it clean. She was told that if she screamed, if she ran, if she told anyone, her mother in Greensboro would be hurt. They knew her mother's address. They showed her photographs of her mother walking from the gas station to her car. They showed her photographs of her mother's house. On the night of December 14th, something broke. Not inside Naomi. She had been broken and rebuilt so many times she no longer knew which pieces were original and which were scar tissue. What broke was the lock. The man who was supposed to be guarding the back room had gotten drunk. He had fallen asleep on a folding chair in the hallway, his chin on his chest, a half-empty bottle of Hennessy on the floor beside him. The keys were clipped to his belt. Naomi had watched the keys for an hour, the way a cat watches a bird, perfectly still, barely breathing. Then she moved. She slid off the mattress. The floor was cold concrete. She crawled on her hands and knees to the door. The gap at the bottom was an inch wide, and she could see his boots, the toes pointing up, the ankles slack, asleep. She reached through the gap. Her arm was thin enough. Months of poor food had taken the flesh from her bones until she was more angle than curve. Her fingers found the key ring. She worked it free from the clip with the slow, excruciating precision of someone defusing a bomb. The clip released with a small click, and she stopped breathing. The man grunted, shifted, did not wake. She unlocked the door from inside. It opened inward, and she had to pull it toward her slowly, inch by inch, to keep it from creaking. The hallway was dark. The man was 3 feet away, his head tilted back, his mouth open. She stepped over his legs. Her bare feet made no sound on the concrete. She reached the back door. It had a deadbolt, but no key was needed from the inside, just a thumb turn. She turned it. The door opened onto the alley. Cold air hit her like a wall of water, and for a second she thought she might pass out. She had not been outside in 4 weeks. She had not felt fresh air in so long that her lungs reacted to it the way a starving person reacts to food, with shock and pain and overwhelming need. She ran. She ran down the alley in her bare feet, the thin dress flapping around her legs, the cold biting into every exposed inch of skin. She ran until she hit the sidewalk, and then she stopped, because she did not know where to go. She did not know where she was. She had never seen this block from the outside. She had only ever seen the room, the hallway, the inside of the van. She stood on the sidewalk in the freezing dark, and she was more lost than she had ever been in her life. And that was when she heard a voice. Low, calm, steady. A voice that said, "Easy. Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." Mrs. Calloway's safe house on 149th Street was run by a woman named Gloria Calloway, who had been doing this work for 27 years. Gloria had been a nurse before she was an activist, and before that she had been a girl not so different from Naomi, a girl who learned young that the world was full of predators wearing human faces. She had turned her brownstone into a refuge, 4 bedrooms, always full, a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and collard greens, a living room with soft couches and thick blankets, and a rule that nobody had to talk if they didn't want to. Gloria and her 3 volunteers provided clothes, food, medical care, and most importantly, time. Time to breathe. Time to remember that safety was not a trick. When Naomi arrived, wrapped in Ezekiel's army surplus coat, with a yellow scarf tied around her bleeding feet, Gloria took one look at her and knew. She knew the way you know a storm is coming, not because you see it, but because you feel the pressure change. She brought Naomi inside. She ran a warm bath, not hot, because hot water on frozen skin causes more damage. She gave her clean clothes. She fed her soup. She did not ask questions, not that night. Questions could wait. Survival came first. It was 3 days before Naomi spoke more than single words. On the 3rd evening, she sat in the kitchen while Gloria made cornbread, and she said, "The man with the yellow scarf, he didn't try to touch me." Gloria stopped stirring. She turned from the stove and looked at Naomi. "No," Gloria said quietly, "he wouldn't." Naomi pulled the yellow scarf from the back of her chair, where she had kept it since that night. She rubbed the fabric between her fingers, feeling the uneven stitches, the small imperfections that meant someone had made this by hand. "He walked in front of me," Naomi said. "He didn't look back, not once. He just walked, and I followed. Like he knew that if he turned around, I would run." Gloria nodded slowly. She set down the wooden spoon and sat across from Naomi at the table. "That man knows a lot of things," Gloria said carefully. "More than people give him credit for." She paused. "He sent me 11 girls in 6 years, Naomi. You're the 12th. Naomi stared at her. The number hit her like a physical force, a wave of understanding that rearranged everything she thought she knew about the man on the corner. 11 girls. 12 now, including her. 12 lives pulled out of the dark by a man everyone on the block called crazy. "Why doesn't he tell the police?" Naomi asked, her voice small. Gloria sighed. The sound held years of frustration, years of fighting a system that moved like mud. "He has," Gloria said flatly. "More times than I can count. He's given them notebooks. He's given them dates, times, descriptions. He's filed reports. He's called hotlines. He's walked into the precinct on 135th Street with folders of evidence, and they looked at him and saw what everyone sees, a homeless man with a Bible. They took his reports, they filed them, and nothing happened, not once." Gloria's voice was steady, but her hands had tightened on the edge of the table. "So he just stands there?" Naomi said, and there was something in her voice that was half disbelief and half awe. "He stands there every day waiting for girls to come out of that alley, and nobody does anything?" Gloria stood and went back to the stove. She picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the cornbread batter with slow, deliberate strokes. "He stands there," Gloria repeated. "He watches, he waits, and when someone comes out of that alley, he's there. He's the first face they see that doesn't want to hurt them. That's what he does. That's all he can do, for now." She added the last two words with an emphasis that Naomi, at 15, did not fully understand. For now. Naomi stayed at Gloria's for 4 months. In that time, Gloria connected her with a lawyer who specialized in trafficking cases, a therapist who spoke softly and never pushed, and eventually with her mother in Greensboro. The phone call to Denise Price was the hardest thing Naomi had ever done. Harder than the lock, harder than the alley, harder than the 12 blocks of frozen sidewalk. She sat in Gloria's kitchen with the phone in her hand and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and she dialed the number she still knew by heart, even after 7 months, even after everything. The phone rang 3 times. Denise picked up. "Hello?" Her mother's voice, the same voice that had sung her to sleep, that had yelled at her to clean her room, that had said, "I love you, baby," every night before bed. Naomi opened her mouth and nothing came out. Just air, just a shaking, formless breath. Then, finally, one word, pushed out through a throat so tight it felt like swallowing glass. "Mama." The sound Denise Price made when she heard that word was not a scream. It was not a cry. It was something deeper and more primal, a sound that came from the very bottom of a mother's soul, the sound of a wound that had been bleeding for 7 months, suddenly, impossibly, beginning to close. "Baby? Naomi? Baby, is that you? Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, where are you? Are you hurt? Baby, talk to me. Please talk to me." Naomi could not talk. She was crying so hard that the phone slipped from her fingers and clattered on the kitchen table, and Gloria picked it up and held it to Naomi's ear and wrapped her other arm around the girl's shoulders and held her steady while she sobbed, and her mother sobbed, and the two of them cried across 400 miles of telephone wire, connected by nothing but electricity and love and the stubborn, miraculous fact that they were both still alive. Denise Price drove to New York the next day. 14 hours straight, no stops except gas. She pulled up in front of Gloria's brownstone in a 10-year-old Camry with a cracked taillight and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, and she was out of the car before the engine stopped running. When she saw Naomi standing in the doorway, she dropped to her knees on the sidewalk. Not from weakness, from gratitude, from the sheer physical weight of relief. Naomi ran to her. They held each other on that cold sidewalk for so long that Gloria, watching from the window, had to turn away and wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. Before Naomi left New York, she asked Gloria to take her to 137th and Lenox. Gloria hesitated. "Are you sure?" she asked. Naomi nodded. She was sure. They drove down in Gloria's car, a practical gray sedan with a child seat in the back that belonged to her grandson. Gloria parked on the opposite side of the street, and Naomi got out and walked to the corner. Ezekiel was there. Of course he was there. Standing in his spot, Bible in one hand, thermos in the other, talking to the wind. He saw her coming and stopped. He recognized her. She could see it in his eyes, the way they softened, the way the lines around them deepened. "You're looking better," he said simply. Naomi nodded. She was wearing a real coat now, a warm one that Gloria had given her, good shoes, a hat that covered her ears. She looked like a different girl. She felt like a different girl, but she wasn't. She was the same girl who had crawled on her hands and knees to reach a set of keys, and she always would be. "I came to give this back," she said, and she held out the yellow scarf. Ezekiel looked at it for a long time. Then he shook his head. "Keep it," he said softly. "It looks better on you." Naomi's eyes burned. She clutched the scarf to her chest and blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from falling. "Thank you," she said, "for that night, for being there." Ezekiel turned his gaze back to the street, to the traffic, to the endless flow of people who did not see what he saw. "I'm always here," he said quietly. "That's the whole point." Naomi stood beside him for one more minute. Then she turned and walked back to Gloria's car. She did not look back. She did not need to. She knew he would be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Standing, watching, waiting. Naomi went back to Greensboro with her mother. She finished high school. She did not finish it easily. There were nights when the walls of her bedroom felt like the walls of that room on 137th Street, and she would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, clawing at sheets that she could not distinguish from the mattress on the concrete floor. There were days when a man's cologne on the subway, or the sound of a van door sliding shut, would send her into a spiral so dark and fast that she would have to sit down on the curb and put her head between her knees and breathe, just breathe, counting to 10 over and over until the world reassembled itself into something survivable. But she survived. She survived because her mother was there, steady and constant and fierce as a lioness. She survived because of a therapist named Dr. Wanda Mitchell, who taught her that healing was not a line going up, but a circle going forward, and that the point was not to forget, but to integrate. She survived because somewhere in New York, a man was standing on a corner with a Bible, and that knowledge, the knowledge that someone was watching, someone was counting, someone refused to look away, gave her a strength she could not explain to anyone who had not been in that alley. She graduated from high school with a 3.7 GPA. She got a scholarship to Howard University. The first day she walked onto campus in Washington, D.C., she stood in the middle of the yard with her backpack and her suitcase and her yellow scarf folded carefully in the front pocket, and she looked at the students streaming past her, laughing, talking, carrying books, wearing Howard sweatshirts, alive and careless in the way that only people who have never had their freedom taken can be, and she felt two things at once: joy and grief. Joy because she was here, because she had made it, because every step from that frozen sidewalk to this sunlit campus was proof that survival was not just a thing you endured, but a thing you built on. Grief because she was different from these students, and she always would be. She studied political science and criminal justice, a double major that her academic advisor, a soft-spoken man named Professor Ellis, called ambitious. Naomi called it necessary. Professor Ellis did not know why it was necessary. Naomi did not tell him. She did not tell anyone at Howard about 137th Street. She carried it the way Ezekiel carried his notebooks, hidden, close to the body, always present. In her sophomore year, she wrote a research paper on systemic failures in trafficking enforcement that earned the highest mark in the class, and a note from her professor that said, "This reads like it was written by someone who has seen these failures firsthand." She stared at that note for a long time, sitting in her dorm room with the afternoon light slanting through the window, and she thought about telling someone. She almost did, but the words would not come. Instead, she threw herself into the work. She joined the debate team and learned to argue with precision and force. She volunteered at a legal aid clinic in Southeast D.C. and learned to sit across the table from people who were afraid and angry and confused, and treat them with the steady, unhurried care that Gloria Calloway had shown her. She learned to listen the way Ezekiel listened, not with an agenda, but with presence. She learned that listening was not passive but active, that it required effort and discipline, and the willingness to hear things that were painful and complicated and messy. She graduated magna cum laude. She went to Columbia Law School on a full merit scholarship. She specialized in policy reform, specifically in anti-trafficking legislation and the systemic failures that allowed trafficking operations to flourish in plain sight, in neighborhoods where everyone knew and no one spoke. During her first year at Columbia, she interned at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She worked in the Public Corruption Unit, and she learned how cases were built. Not the flashy courtroom theatrics of television, but the slow, meticulous, unglamorous work of gathering evidence, establishing patterns, connecting dots that seemed random until you stepped back far enough to see the picture. She learned how grand juries worked. She learned how subpoenas were issued. She learned the architecture of justice, and she studied it the way a prisoner studies the walls, looking for the places where the stone was weakest. She thought about Ezekiel's notebooks. She thought about them every day. She thought about the dates, the times, the descriptions, the partial license plates. She thought about 12 girls pulled from the dark. She thought about the ones who were never pulled out, the ones who were still in there, behind the walls of Gerald Fontaine's building, in rooms with no windows and locks on the outside. She thought about them while she sat in law school lectures about constitutional rights and the burden of proof. She thought about them while she ate lunch in the student cafeteria. She thought about them while she slept. She could not stop thinking about them. After law school, Naomi did not go into private practice. She did not take the six-figure job at the corporate firm in Midtown that recruited her with flattering emails and a corner office with a view of Central Park. She went into politics. People told her she was crazy, and the irony of that word made her smile. A small, hard, knowing smile that had nothing to do with humor. She ran for city council in District 9, which covered most of central Harlem. She ran on a platform of community safety, accountability, and the kind of transparency that made powerful people uncomfortable. She won by 11,000 votes. She was 29 years old. She was the youngest city councilwoman in the district's history. On the night of her victory, she stood in front of her supporters at a community center on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and gave a speech that the Amsterdam News called a masterclass in controlled fire. She did not cry. She did not gloat. She spoke clearly, calmly, with the steady precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment not in front of a mirror, but in the privacy of her own survival. There are corners in this city, she said, where people stand and scream the truth and nobody listens. My job is to make sure someone finally does. The applause was thunderous. The cameras flashed. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Nobody in that room, except Naomi and her mother and Gloria Calloway, who was sitting in the third row with tears streaming down her face, knew that she was not speaking in metaphor. The first thing Naomi did after taking office was request a meeting with the commanding officer of the 32nd Precinct. His name was Captain Victor Espinoza, a 24-year veteran with a thick mustache and a tired expression that suggested he had seen everything the city had to offer and was no longer impressed. Naomi sat across from him in his office, which smelled of burnt coffee and old files, and she placed a folder on his desk. The folder was thick. It was not one of Ezekiel's notebooks, not yet, but it was the beginning. I want to talk to you about 137th and Lenox, Naomi said. Captain Espinoza leaned back in his chair. The chair creaked. He folded his hands over his stomach, and Naomi noticed that his fingers were thick and scarred, the hands of a man who had come up through patrol, not through a desk. "What about it?" he asked, in a tone that was polite but not warm. Naomi opened the folder. "Over the past decade," she said, "your precinct has received at least 47 complaints about a street preacher on that corner. 43 of them came from the same woman, a salon owner named Delphine Okafor. Your officers responded to every complaint. They interacted with the preacher. They never arrested him. They never cited him." Captain Espinoza nodded slowly. "I remember the file. The preacher. Old guy, brown coat, Bible, harmless." Naomi's expression did not change. "What I need you to tell me, Captain, is whether any of your officers, during any of those 47 visits to that corner, ever walked around to the back of the buildings on that block, specifically the building behind the check-cashing place owned by Gerald Fontaine." There was a silence, a long one. Captain Espinoza's hands uncrossed. He sat up straighter. The tired expression was gone, replaced by something sharper and more cautious. "Why are you asking?" he said. "Because I was in that building," Naomi said. She said it the way you would say the time of day, flat, factual, no drama, no quiver in the voice, no theatrical pause. Just the truth laid on the desk between them like a knife. "I was held in a room on the second floor for 8 weeks when I was 15 years old. I was brought there through the back alley in a van with no plates. I was one of at least 12 girls who were held there over a period of 6 years. The preacher your officers spoke to 47 times was watching that building. He was documenting what he saw. He came to this precinct multiple times with evidence, and he was dismissed." Captain Espinosa stared at her. His jaw worked, as if he were chewing on something bitter. "Councilwoman," he began, but Naomi raised a hand. "I'm not here to accuse you personally," she said, and her voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I'm here to tell you that I am opening a formal investigation into trafficking activity on that block, and I am going to request the involvement of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the Manhattan DA's office, and the Department of Investigation. I am also going to subpoena every report your officers filed after visiting that corner, every single one." She paused. "And then I'm going to compare those reports to the notebooks that Ezekiel Morrow has been keeping for the past 11 years. Captain Espinosa said nothing for a very long time. The clock on his wall ticked. A phone rang in the outer office and went unanswered. Finally, he leaned forward, put his elbows on the desk and said, "What do you need from me?" Naomi closed the folder. She looked at him with steady, unblinking eyes. The eyes of a girl who had once crawled across a cold floor in the dark to steal the keys to her own freedom. "I need you to help me burn it down," she said quietly. "All of it, every brick." The investigation took 14 months. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was the slow, grinding, relentless work of truth. The kind of work that does not make for good television, but makes for good justice. Naomi assembled a task force that included 2 FBI agents, an assistant district attorney named Rachel Sung, 3 detectives from the NYPD Human Trafficking Unit, and a forensic accountant named Carl Washington, who was quiet and round-shouldered, and whose superpower was following money the way a bloodhound follows scent. The first step was Ezekiel's notebooks. Naomi went to 137th and Lenox on a Saturday morning. Ezekiel was there. He was always there. She had not seen him in person since that day she returned the yellow scarf, almost 12 years ago. He looked older. The lines on his face were deeper. The brown coat had been replaced with a different brown coat, equally worn. But his eyes were the same, sharp, watchful, patient. The eyes of a man who has been keeping vigil. "I need your notebooks," Naomi said, standing in front of him on the sidewalk, while Mrs. Okafor watched from behind the glass of her salon, frowning. "All of them." Ezekiel studied her face. "You're the girl," he said, not a question, a statement. "The one from December, the one with no shoes." Naomi nodded. "I'm the girl," she said, "and I'm a city councilwoman now, and I'm going to do what the police wouldn't." Ezekiel reached inside his coat and pulled out a notebook, the current one, half full. Then he unzipped an inner pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "The rest are in a storage unit on 128th Street, he said. 11 notebooks. This is the key and the address." He held out the paper and the notebook. His hand was steady, no tremor, no hesitation. He had been waiting for this moment for over a decade, and now that it was here, he was as calm as a man setting down a heavy load after a long walk. "Everything is dated," he said. "Descriptions are as detailed as I could manage. Some of the license plates are partial. The cardboard slipped sometimes, but not always." He paused. "There are patterns. They rotate girls on a schedule. Tuesdays and Thursdays are the busiest. The vans come from different directions, but they always park in the same spot behind the building." Naomi took the paper and the notebook. Her hand, unlike his, was not steady. It shook, not from fear this time, but from something else. A pressure building behind her sternum, a sensation like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you are about to jump, not down, but forward. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried the weight of 12 years, 2 of which she had spent in that room, and 10 of which she had spent building herself into a weapon capable of tearing that room apart. Ezekiel nodded once. Then he picked up his Bible and his thermos and went back to doing what he had always done: watching, waiting, but now, for the first time, waiting with purpose he could feel in his bones. The notebooks were a revelation. Rachel Sung, the assistant DA, sat in her office at 1 Hogan Place and read through them one by one, and as she read, her face changed. It went from professional interest to surprise to disbelief to a cold, focused anger that settled into the set of her jaw and did not leave. "This is meticulous," she said to Naomi. "This man documented everything: dates, times, physical descriptions, vehicle descriptions. He even noted the weather conditions, which is actually useful for corroboration purposes." She set down the 5th notebook and looked up. Why in the world didn't anyone listen to him? Naomi did not answer the question. She did not need to. They both knew the answer. A black man on a street corner with a Bible and a brown coat, talking to pigeons and quoting scripture, does not fit the profile of a credible witness. He fits the profile of a nuisance, a problem, a thing to be stepped around. The system had not failed because it was broken. The system had worked exactly as designed, for some people and against others. That was what Naomi intended to change. Carl Washington, the forensic accountant, followed the money. Gerald Fontaine's check-cashing business was the front. The actual revenue came through a web of shell companies registered in Delaware and New Jersey, and Carl traced each one with the dogged patience of a man who genuinely loves spreadsheets. He found that Gerald was not the mastermind. Gerald was the landlord. He rented the upper floors of his building to a man named Marcus Cole, who operated a staffing agency that existed only on paper. Marcus Cole, in turn, was connected to a network that stretched from New York to North Carolina to Atlanta to Houston, a pipeline that moved girls along Interstate 95 like freight. The FBI agents, Agents Delgado and Park, conducted surveillance. They confirmed what Ezekiel's notebooks had documented: the vans, the girls, the back door, the schedule. They planted a camera in the alley and captured 6 weeks of footage that turned Rachel Sung's cold anger into a simmering fury. "We have enough," she told Naomi after reviewing the footage. "We have more than enough. We have enough to indict Fontaine, Cole, and at least 8 others. We have enough to shut down the network in 3 states. She paused. "We also have enough to ask some very uncomfortable questions about the 32nd precinct." Naomi nodded. She had expected this. The precinct angle was the part that would get the headlines. 47 visits to a corner, 47 interactions with a man who was trying to report a crime, 47 opportunities to look behind the building. And not once in 11 years, had anyone thought to walk around the block and knock on the back door. Whether this was negligence or complicity was a question for the Department of Investigation, and Naomi had already filed the referral. But before the arrests, before the indictments, before the headlines and the press conferences and the public reckoning, Naomi wanted one thing. She wanted the people on that block to see what they had been part of. Not the criminals. The criminals would have their day in court. She wanted the bystanders, the neighbors, the people who had looked the other way, who had adjusted their eyes, who had turned up the television. She wanted them to understand what their silence had cost. She called a community meeting. She reserved the auditorium at the Schomburg Center on Malcolm X Boulevard, a space large enough to hold 300 people and historic enough to lend gravity to whatever happened inside it. She sent invitations. She did not say what the meeting was about. She said only that it concerned matters of public safety on 137th Street and the surrounding blocks, and that attendance by local business owners was strongly encouraged. The phrase "strongly encouraged," coming from a city councilwoman with subpoena power, was understood for what it was: a summons. The night before the meeting, Naomi sat alone in her apartment on Frederick Douglass Boulevard. The apartment was quiet. The radiator ticked. Outside, a siren wailed down the avenue and faded. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and she stared at the folder in front of her. The folder she would carry to the podium, the folder that contained the single sheet of paper that would break the block open like a stone dropped on glass. She had rehearsed her speech 100 times. She knew every word, every pause, every breath. But tonight, the words felt different, heavy, alive, dangerous. She picked up her phone and called her mother. Denise answered on the second ring, the way she always did when Naomi called, as if she kept the phone within arm's reach at all times, as if she was still, after all these years, afraid that her daughter might disappear again. "Hey, baby," Denise said. "You okay?" Naomi leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. "I'm scared, Mama," she said. The admission surprised her. She had not felt scared in a long time. She had trained herself not to feel scared, the way a boxer trains themselves to take a punch. Not by avoiding it, but by absorbing it and staying on their feet. "Of what?" Denise asked, her voice careful and warm. "Of standing up there and telling a room full of people what happened to me," Naomi said. "Of looking at the people who lived on that block and telling them what was happening 3 doors down from their shops while they braided hair and cashed checks and sold tamales." She paused. "Of seeing their faces when they realize." Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, you walked 12 blocks in the snow with no shoes. You crawled across a floor to steal the keys to your own life. You think a podium is going to stop you?" Naomi laughed. It was a small, wet, shaky laugh, but it was real. "No, Mama," she said. "I don't think anything is going to stop me." She hung up. She drank her cold tea. She read through her notes one final time. Then she went to bed, and she slept, deeply, soundly, without dreams, for the first time in weeks. The auditorium was full. Mrs. Okafor was there, seated in the middle section, wearing her best dress and expression of wary curiosity. Gerald Fontaine was there, in the back row, arms crossed, gold chain gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The barber was there. The bodega owner was there. The woman who sold tamales was there, though she looked nervous and kept glancing at the exits. Residents from the surrounding buildings were there, along with local pastors, school administrators, a reporter from the Amsterdam News, and 2 camera crews from local television stations. Captain Espinoza was there, in civilian clothes, sitting near the side door with a look on his face that was half dread and half resignation. And Ezekiel Moro was there. He sat in the front row in his brown coat with his Bible on his lap. He had trimmed his beard. He looked different indoors, smaller somehow, without the backdrop of the street and the sky. But his eyes were the same, alert, watchful, fixed on the stage where Naomi would soon stand. Naomi walked to the podium at exactly 7 o'clock. She wore a dark blue suit. Her hair was pulled back. She carried a single folder. She looked out at the audience, at the faces she recognized and the ones she didn't, and she took a breath. Not a deep, dramatic breath, a controlled one, a fighter's breath. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her voice was even and clear and carried to the back of the room without a microphone, though there was one in front of her. "My name is Naomi Price. Most of you know me as Councilwoman Price. Some of you know me from the campaign. But before I was any of those things, I was a 15-year-old girl from Greensboro, North Carolina, and I was held against my will in a room above the check-cashing place on 137th Street for 8 weeks. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of attention, but the jagged silence of a room full of people who have just been punched in the stomach simultaneously. Mrs. Okafor's hand went to her mouth. Gerald Fontaine uncrossed his arms. The bodega owner looked at the floor. "I was one of at least 47 girls and young women who were trafficked through that building over the past 12 years, Naomi continued. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times, in her head, in the shower, in the car, in front of the mirror, until the words were as smooth and worn as river stones. The operation was run by a man named Marcus Cole, who rented the upper floors from the building's owner. The girls were brought in through the back alley in vans with no license plates. They were held in rooms with no windows. They were fed once a day. They were threatened, beaten, and sold." She paused. The silence was absolute. 300 people, not one of them breathing. Naomi opened her folder and removed a single sheet of paper. In the course of our 14-month investigation, we obtained and reviewed detailed records kept by a man named Ezekiel Morrow. Some of you know him as the street preacher on the corner. Some of you know him as a nuisance. Some of you called the police on him. Some of you poured water on his head. She did not look at Gerald Fontaine when she said this, but she did not need to. Every head in the room turned to the back row. Gerald's face went gray. The color drained out of it so fast it was like watching a light switch flip. His hand went to his gold chain and he gripped it, the way a drowning man grips a rope. "Mr. Morrow is not crazy," Naomi said. "Mr. Morrow is a former social worker who spent 11 years standing on that corner, documenting the trafficking operation that was happening behind your businesses, beneath your windows, on your block. He filled 13 notebooks with dates, times, descriptions, and vehicle information. He reported this information to the police repeatedly. He was ignored. He was dismissed. He was treated like garbage." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough for the room to hear the girl behind the councilwoman. She steadied herself. She placed both hands flat on the podium, fingers spread, pressing the wood as if pressing the ground, grounding herself. "I am standing here tonight because of that man," she said. And now she did look at Ezekiel, who was sitting in the front row with his hands folded on his Bible, tears running down his weathered cheeks, silent, still, steady as stone. "On the coldest night of December, 15 years ago, I escaped from that building. I had no coat. I had no shoes. I was barefoot on frozen concrete, and I had nowhere to go. And there he was, standing on his corner, at 11 degrees, waiting." A woman in the middle of the auditorium began to cry. Then another. The sound spread through the room like ripples in water. Mrs. Okafor was weeping openly, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks, her hands clutching the purse in her lap so tightly the leather crumpled. Franklin, sitting beside her, put his hand on her back. His own eyes were wet. He had known. Not the full truth, but some part of it. He had known that Ezekiel was not what he seemed, and he had stayed silent. The weight of that silence was on his shoulders now, and it was heavier than anything he had ever carried. "Tomorrow morning," Naomi said, "the FBI, in conjunction with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the NYPD Human Trafficking Task Force, will execute arrest warrants for Gerald Fontaine, Marcus Cole, and 9 other individuals connected to this operation. Simultaneously, law enforcement in North Carolina, Georgia, and Texas will execute warrants for members of the larger network. This is the result of 14 months of investigation, but it is also the result of 11 years of work by one man who refused to look away." She looked at Ezekiel again. "Mr. Morrow, would you please stand?" Ezekiel stood. He rose slowly, his knees creaking from years of standing on concrete in every weather. He turned to face the room, and for the first time, the people of 137th and Lenox saw him. Not the preacher, not the crazy man, not the nuisance, but the man. The real man. The man who had given up his career, his apartment, his sister, his comfort, his dignity, to stand on a corner and watch. To count. To document. To be there when a barefoot girl came out of an alley on the worst night of her life. The applause started slowly. A single pair of hands in the back, then another, then another. It built like a wave, rolling forward through the auditorium until 300 people were on their feet, clapping, crying, some of them unable to look Ezekiel in the eye because the shame was too thick, and some of them unable to stop looking because they needed him to see that they understood now, even if they hadn't before. Gerald Fontaine did not clap. Gerald Fontaine did not stand. Gerald Fontaine sat in his chair in the back row, and his face was the color of old paper, and his hands were shaking so hard that the gold chain rattled against his chest. He knew what was coming. He had known since the moment Naomi said his name. He thought about the back door of his building. He thought about the rent checks that Marcus Cole paid in cash, thick envelopes with no questions asked. He thought about the nights he heard sounds from the upper floors, thumping, muffled voices, a cry that was cut short, and turned up the radio in his office and poured himself another drink. He had not put girls in rooms. He had not driven vans. But he had rented the space, and he had looked the other way, and he had cashed the checks, and in the architecture of evil, that made him a load-bearing wall. The next morning, the arrest came like clockwork. At 6 a.m., FBI agents and NYPD detectives descended on 137th Street in a convoy of unmarked cars and black SUVs. They arrested Gerald Fontaine at his home on Riverside Drive, not on 137th Street, not above the check-cashing place, but in a brownstone with a view of the Hudson River, a home paid for with money that smelled like suffering. Gerald came out in handcuffs, still in his bathrobe, his gold chain catching the early morning light. The cameras were there. Naomi had made sure of that. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The community needed to see. They needed to see that consequences were real. Marcus Cole was arrested at a hotel in Newark, where he had been staying with a woman who was not his wife, and a laptop that contained records the forensic accountant would later describe as a roadmap to hell. The laptop held financial records, communications, photographs, schedules, and the names of over 60 girls and women who had been moved through the network in the past decade. Carl Washington spent 3 weeks in a windowless office at 1 Hogan Place, cross-referencing those names with missing persons reports across 4 states. He found matches for 42 of them. 42 girls reported missing. 42 families who had waited by the phone. 42 beds that had gone cold. 9 others were arrested in the following days. Drivers, recruiters, a man who ran a modeling agency in Atlanta that was nothing more than a hunting ground. A woman in Houston who managed a network of apartments where girls were held between moves. The network was large, but it was not invincible. It had survived for over a decade because it operated in the space between seeing and looking away. In the gap between suspicion and action. In the comfortable silence of a community that had decided, collectively and without ever saying it out loud, that some things were better left alone. The trials took 2 years. Gerald Fontaine was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Marcus Cole received 35 years. The others received sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years. During the trial, the prosecution played surveillance footage from the alley camera. The footage showed girls being led from vans to the back door of Gerald's building. Some of them were crying. Some of them were silent. All of them were young. The jury watched the footage with the kind of focused, horrified attention that changes people, that rearranges the furniture of their moral understanding and leaves them unable to look at the world the same way they did before. Naomi testified. She sat in the witness box and described in precise and unflinching detail what had been done to her in that building. She described the room, the mattress, the lock, the food, the threats, the photographs of her mother. She described the man who fell asleep drunk with the keys on his belt. She described the crawl across the floor, the click of the key ring, the turn of the deadbolt, the blast of cold air. She described the alley, the sidewalk, the frozen concrete under her bare feet, and the voice that came out of the darkness, low, calm, steady, that said, "Easy, easy now." When she finished, the courtroom was silent for 12 seconds. The judge, an older woman named Honorable Patricia Okonkwo, took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes. Then she said, "Thank you, Councilwoman Price. You may step down." After the convictions, the attention turned to the precinct. The Department of Investigation conducted a review of the 32nd Precinct's handling of complaints related to 137th and Lenox. The review found that Ezekiel Morrow had filed formal reports on 7 separate occasions over a period of 9 years. Each report included detailed descriptions of suspected trafficking activity. Each report had been classified as unfounded or insufficient evidence. None of the reports had resulted in follow-up investigation. None had been forwarded to the specialized trafficking units. 3 of the reports had been misfiled and were found in a storage room in the precinct's basement, still in their original manila envelopes, unopened. Captain Espinoza was not charged with the crime. There was no evidence that he had been complicit in the trafficking operation, but he was found to have presided over a culture of institutional negligence that had allowed the operation to continue unchecked. He was offered the choice between early retirement and a public disciplinary hearing. He chose retirement. On his last day, he drove to 137th and Lenox and parked across the street from Ezekiel's corner. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching the old man stand on the sidewalk with his Bible and his thermos. Then he got out, crossed the street, and stood in front of Ezekiel. Mrs. Okafor closed her salon. Not because she was forced to. Nobody accused her of involvement in the trafficking, and the investigation found no evidence that she knew what was happening behind Gerald's building. She closed it because she could no longer stand behind the chair and look out the window at the corner where Ezekiel stood, knowing what she now knew about who he was and what he had been doing all those years while she called the police on him 43 times. The shame was a physical thing. It sat on her chest like a stone, and no amount of prayer or justification or telling herself that she hadn't known could lift it. She went to see Ezekiel one morning, a week after the verdicts. She walked across the street from her darkened salon. The sign was still up, but the lights were off, and the chairs were empty, and the appointment book with its red marks was closed. And she stood in front of him. She was crying before she reached the curb. Big, ugly, helpless tears that she did not try to hide. "Mr. Morrow," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "I called the police on you 43 times. 43 times. While those girls were in that building. While you were trying to help them. I stood in my salon, and I complained about you to my customers, and I told everyone you were crazy and I wanted you gone." She was shaking. Her hands, the strong hands that had braided 1,000,000 heads of hair, hung at her sides, trembling. Ezekiel watched her cry. He did not move toward her. He did not offer comfort. He was not cruel about it, but he did not pretend that what she had done was nothing. It was something. 43 phone calls. 43 attempts to remove the one person on the block who was trying to make a difference. That was something. And Ezekiel respected her enough to let her feel the weight of it. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear to God, Mr. Morrow, I didn't know what was in that building." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. And he meant it. He did not think Mrs. Okafor knew about the girls, but he also knew that not knowing was its own kind of failure. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice muffled by the handkerchief. Ezekiel considered the question. He looked past her, at the block, at the buildings, at the street where he had stood for over a decade. "You start looking," he said. "That's all anyone can do. You start looking at the things you used to look away from, and when you see something, you say something. Not to the police, not to a hotline, to the person standing next to you. Because that's where it starts. Not with the law, with the neighbor." Mrs. Okafor nodded. She wiped her eyes. She looked at the handkerchief in her hand, at the careful folds, at the clean white fabric. "Can I keep this?" she asked. Ezekiel almost smiled. "Keep it," he said. Franklin came to see him too, a few days later. Franklin came alone, without Delphine, and he brought 2 cups of coffee from the bodega. He handed one to Ezekiel without a word, and the 2 men stood side by side on the corner, drinking coffee in the thin winter sunlight, not speaking for a long time. Finally, Franklin said, "I saw you give your coat to that woman in the rain. Years ago. I never forgot that." Ezekiel sipped his coffee. He did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit between them, comfortable and honest. "You knew something was wrong," Ezekiel said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. Franklin nodded. He stared at the traffic going by, at the taxis and the buses and the delivery trucks. "I felt it," he admitted. "Late at night, sometimes. I would come home from the late shift, and I would see the van in the alley. And I would think about it, about what could be in a van that comes at midnight and leaves before dawn. But I never looked. I never walked around the block and looked." He took a long, shaky breath. "I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of what I'd find. Afraid of what I'd have to do about it." Ezekiel nodded. "Fear is human," he said. "Looking away is human. But there's a cost. There's always a cost. And the people who pay it are never the ones who are afraid. They're the ones who have no choice but to be brave, because nobody else will be brave for them." Franklin finished his coffee. He crushed the cup in his fist, slowly, deliberately, the paper crackling. "My daughter is 12, he said quietly. Every time I think about those girls in that building, I think about my daughter." Ezekiel turned to look at him for the first time. "Then think about her," Ezekiel said. "And next time you see a van in an alley at midnight, don't go home. Call me." The block changed after the arrests. It changed slowly, the way a forest changes after a fire. New growth pushing up through the char, green and uncertain and tentative. Gerald Fontaine's check-cashing place was seized by the federal government and eventually demolished. In its place, a community organization built a resource center that offered legal aid, counseling, and job training. Naomi cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony, and she did not make a speech. She simply cut the ribbon, smiled for the cameras, and went inside to look at the rooms. Clean rooms. Rooms with windows. Rooms with doors that locked from the inside. The alley behind the building was paved over and turned into a small garden. Tomato plants, marigolds, a bench. It was not much. A garden does not erase what happened in the rooms above it. But it was something. It was a patch of green in a concrete canyon, and on warm evenings, people from the block would sit on the bench and talk, and sometimes, if the wind was right, the smell of marigolds would drift around the corner to where Ezekiel stood, and he would close his eyes and breathe it in. Naomi visited the block regularly. She walked the streets of her district with the intimate knowledge of someone who had been both its victim and its champion, and she did not look away from the things that were still broken. There were plenty. Trafficking did not end with one investigation. Poverty did not end with one resource center. The systemic failures that had allowed a trafficking operation to run for over a decade in the middle of a neighborhood were not fixed by arrests and convictions. They required structural change, policy, funding, training, accountability, and Naomi pursued each one with the methodical, relentless energy of someone who understood, in her body, the cost of inaction. She introduced legislation that required mandatory training for patrol officers in recognizing signs of trafficking. She secured funding for a citywide anti-trafficking task force. She pushed for a review of how citizen reports were handled, classified, and followed up on. And she fought for a system that flagged reports from the same location for pattern analysis, so that 47 visits to the same corner over 11 years would never again be treated as 47 isolated incidents. She also stayed in touch with Gloria Calloway, whose safe house on 149th Street continued to operate. Quieter now, but just as necessary. Gloria was getting older. Her knees hurt. Her glasses were thicker. But she still opened the door at midnight when the buzzer sounded 3 times, pause, then twice more. She still ran the warm bath. She still made the soup. She still sat across the kitchen table and waited, in patient silence, for the girl to speak. Naomi sent Gloria flowers every December 14th, the anniversary, not of her escape. She did not think of it as an escape, but as a beginning. The day she became someone new. The day she walked 12 blocks behind a man with a yellow scarf and learned that there were still people in the world who would walk ahead of you without looking back, who would give you their coat and ask nothing in return, who would stand on a freezing corner for 11 years because they believed that watching mattered, that counting mattered, that being present in the face of evil was not futile but essential. The flowers were always yellow. Sunflowers, usually, sometimes daffodils. Gloria put them in a vase on the kitchen table, where every girl who sat in that kitchen could see them. She never explained what the flowers meant. She didn't have to. The yellow spoke for itself. Warm, bright, stubborn, refusing to be dimmed by the dark. 3 years after the convictions, Naomi received a phone call from Ezekiel's sister, Margaret. Margaret had seen the news coverage of the trials and the investigation, and she had watched her brother's face on the television screen, and something that had been locked inside her for over a decade finally opened. She called Naomi's office and left a message with Naomi's assistant, a young man named David, who wrote down the name and number with careful handwriting and placed the note on Naomi's desk. Naomi called Margaret back that evening. Margaret lived in Philadelphia, in a small house in West Oak Lane, with a garden and a cat and the stubborn loneliness of a woman who had cut off the person she loved most because she could not understand his choices. "I thought he was insane," Margaret said, her voice thin and brittle over the phone. "I thought he had thrown his life away. He had a good job, he had a future. And then he just quit, gave everything up, went to stand on a street corner. I begged him to come home. I begged him to see a doctor. He wouldn't listen. She paused. Naomi could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, the way people breathe when they are trying not to cry. I stopped calling him, Margaret continued. I stopped visiting. I sent him the scarf because it was Christmas and I couldn't just pretend he didn't exist. But I didn't call, I didn't write, for years. And the whole time he was— Her voice broke. He was saving children, she whispered. He was standing on that corner saving children, and I left him alone. Naomi listened. She did not interrupt. She did not offer reassurance. Some guilt needs to be spoken aloud, needs to exist in the space between two people before it can begin to dissolve. He loves you, Naomi said finally. He wore that scarf every day. Even after it was faded and unraveling, he wore it. Margaret was silent for a long time. Then she asked very quietly, "Is he okay? Is he healthy? Does he have somewhere to sleep?" Naomi hesitated. The truth was that Ezekiel was not okay, not in the way Margaret meant. He was thin. He was tired. His knees were bad. He slept at a shelter when he slept at all. He had given everything: his career, his savings, his comfort, his health, his family, to stand on a corner and watch. He had done it willingly, and he had done it without complaint. But willingness does not prevent the body from wearing down. "He needs you," Naomi said simply. "Go see him." Margaret drove to New York the following Saturday. She parked on 137th Street and walked to the corner, and when she saw her brother standing there in his brown coat with his Bible and his thermos, she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and pressed both hands to her face and wept. Ezekiel saw her. He set down his thermos. He closed his Bible. He walked to her, slowly, his bad knees protesting every step, and he stood in front of his sister for the first time in over a decade. "Maggie," he said. That was all. Just her name. The name he had called her since childhood, since the days when they shared a bedroom in their mother's apartment on Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn, when he was 10 and she was 7, and the world was small and safe and full of their mother's cooking. Margaret threw her arms around him. She buried her face in his coat, the coat that smelled like the street, like coffee, like cold air and persistence, and she held on. He held her back. His arms went around her, and for a moment, his composure cracked. Just for a moment. His chin trembled, his eyes closed. A single tear ran down the deep groove beside his nose. Then he steadied. He held his sister, and he breathed, and he was still. "Come home," Margaret said into his chest. "Please, Zeke, come home." Ezekiel pulled back gently. He held her at arm's length and looked at her face. Older now, lines around the mouth, gray at the temples, but the same eyes, the same stubbornness, the same love. "I can't leave yet," he said. "Not yet. There's still work." Margaret's face fell, and he saw the argument forming behind her eyes. The old argument, the one about wasting his life, about throwing it all away. But before she could speak, a woman walked up to them. Mrs. Okafor. She had been watching from across the street, from the window of her closed salon, where she sometimes still sat among the empty chairs. "He saved my soul," Mrs. Okafor said to Margaret. Her voice was raw, honest, stripped of the pride and the bluster that had defined her for 20 years. "I didn't even know my soul needed saving, but he did it anyway. He stood there, and I hated him for it, and the whole time, he was the only person on this block who was doing the right thing." She looked at Ezekiel. "Your brother is the best man I have ever known," she said, "and I spent 6 years trying to get rid of him." She laughed, a short, harsh, broken laugh that was mostly a sob. Margaret stared at her. Then she looked back at her brother, and something shifted in her expression. The last piece of a puzzle falling into place. The moment when understanding finally catches up with love. "Okay," Margaret said softly. "Okay, but you're coming to Philadelphia for Christmas." Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not a big smile, a small one, barely there, like the first crack of light at the edge of dawn. But it was real, and Margaret saw it, and that was enough. On a Tuesday morning in April, 18 months after the last conviction, Naomi held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. She had called it to announce new legislation, the Morrow Price Act, a comprehensive anti-trafficking reform package that mandated cross-agency coordination, funded community-based reporting systems, and established a civilian oversight board for trafficking-related complaints. The bill had passed the city council unanimously. The mayor signed it on the spot, in front of cameras, with a pen that Naomi had given him. A simple black pen, nothing special, the kind of pen a social worker might carry. Ezekiel was invited, but did not attend. He did not like press conferences. He did not like cameras. He did not like attention of any kind, which was ironic for a man who had stood on a street corner in full view of the public for over a decade. But that was different. On the corner, he was invisible. He was part of the scenery. On a stage, behind a podium, under lights. That was a different kind of visibility, the kind that made his skin crawl. He stayed on his corner. He listened to the press conference on his phone, a phone Naomi had given him, a simple one with big buttons and a long battery life. He listened to the speeches. He heard his name. He nodded. Then he put the phone away and picked up his Bible. But there was one more thing Naomi needed to do, one final piece of the circle that needed the close. She arranged it quietly, without press, without cameras, without an audience. She called Gloria Calloway and asked her to bring something. Then she drove to 137th and Lenox. Naomi took the scarf from Gloria and held it out to Ezekiel. "Your sister made this," she said. "She wanted you to have it." Ezekiel looked at the scarf. He reached out and touched the wool, running his fingers over the stitches, feeling the texture, the weight, the care that was woven into every loop. His face did not change. His expression stayed calm, steady, the face of a man who had mastered the art of stillness. But his hand trembled. Just slightly, just enough for Naomi and Gloria to see. "It's the same pattern," he said softly. She remembered. He took the scarf and wound it around his neck. The yellow was bright against his brown coat, a splash of color against the gray, the same way the first scarf had been, a small, warm, stubborn light in a cold world. He adjusted it, pulled it up to cover his chin, looked out at the street, at the traffic, at the people passing by, at the corner that had been his post, his station, his mission. "Thank you," he said, and the word held everything. The cold nights and the hot summers, the mop water and the silence, the notebooks and the alley, and the barefoot girl who became a councilwoman who tore down the walls he had spent a decade documenting. It held 11 years of watching and waiting and believing that someone, someday, would listen. "Thank you," he said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. Then he turned back to the street and adjusted his Bible under his arm and lifted his thermos. Naomi watched him for a moment. Then she turned to Gloria. "You think he'll ever stop?" she asked quietly. Gloria looked at Ezekiel standing on his corner in the fading afternoon light, the yellow scarf bright around his neck, his eyes scanning the block with the patience of a man who understood that the work was never finished, that there would always be another van, another alley, another girl with no shoes, and that someone needed to be there, someone needed to be watching. "No," Gloria said, with the tenderness that came from 27 years of opening doors at midnight. "He won't stop. That's not who he is." Naomi nodded. She had known the answer before she asked. She pulled her coat tighter and walked back toward her car. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back one more time. Ezekiel was still there, standing, watching, the yellow scarf catching the last of the sunlight, bright and stubborn and unmistakable, like a signal fire on a dark shore. The evening settled over Harlem the way it always did. Slow, golden, then gray, then dark. The streetlights came on. The food truck closed. The new shops along the block, the ones that had replaced the emptiness left by Gerald's demolition, began to lower their gates. Mrs. Okafor, who had reopened not a salon, but a small community space where neighborhood women could meet and talk and watch over the block through the wide front window, turned off her lights and locked the door. She waved to Ezekiel as she crossed the street. He raised a hand in return. The block was different now. Not healed. A block does not heal from something like that. Not in a few years, maybe not ever. But it was awake. The people on 137th and Lenox were no longer in the business of looking away. They watched. Not with fear and not with suspicion, but with the simple, attentive presence of people who had learned, the hard way, what happens when a community closes its eyes. Franklin still brought Ezekiel coffee sometimes. He would cross the street with 2 cups, hand one over without a word, and stand beside the old man for a few minutes before heading home. He never said much during these visits. He didn't need to. The coffee said enough. It said, "I see you." It said, "I'm sorry." It said, "I'm here." Those 3 small sentences, spoken in the language of a paper cup and a warm drink, were more than anyone on that block had said to Ezekiel for 11 years. Naomi's mother, Denise, moved from Greensboro to New York. She got a job at the resource center that had been built on the site of Gerald's building. She worked the front desk, greeting people who came in for help with the same steady warmth that she had raised her daughter with. Every morning she walked past Ezekiel's corner on her way to work. Every morning she stopped, looked at him, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Morrow." Every morning he replied, "Good morning, Miss Denise." They did not say more than that. The ritual was enough. Naomi kept the original yellow scarf in a glass frame in her office. It hung on the wall behind her desk, faded and worn, and still carrying in its fibers the memory of a December night and a 12-block walk. Visitors to her office sometimes asked about it. "That's a nice scarf," they would say, looking at the simple yarn and the uneven stitches. Naomi would glance at it and smile, a small private smile that belonged to a version of herself that existed before the councilwoman, before the law degree, before Howard and Columbia and the investigation and the convictions. A version that was 15 years old and barefoot and terrified, standing on a frozen sidewalk with nowhere to go, hearing a voice in the darkness that said, "Easy, easy now." It was a gift, she would say, and that was true, but it was also not enough, because that scarf was not just a gift, it was proof. Proof that on the worst night of her life, in the coldest hour, on the most dangerous block, in the middle of a city that was too busy and too loud and too crowded to notice one girl with no shoes, there was a man with nothing, a man everyone called crazy, a man who gave her his coat and his scarf and asked nothing in return, and walked ahead of her without looking back, because he understood that trust is not demanded but offered, slowly, carefully, one step at a time, into the dark. The sun went down over Lenox Avenue, and the lights came on, and the city hummed its restless, endless hum. On the corner of 137th Street, Ezekiel Morrow stood in his brown coat and his yellow scarf, his Bible under one arm and his thermos in his hand, watching the block with eyes that had seen everything and still chose to look. The street was quiet, the air was cool, and the old man stood there the way he had always stood there, the way he always would, a sentinel, a witness, a keeper of notebooks, a giver of coats, a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to leave. The scarf around his neck was bright in the lamplight, yellow like a candle, yellow like a promise, yellow like the first color you see when the long night finally ends. Thank you for being here until the end. If you enjoy stories like this, please like the video and subscribe for more.